My name is Tyler Brinks, and we're doing a webinar today on swim baits for smallmouth. Honestly, two of my favorite things in the world. I love smallmouth bass. I love swim baits. It's a great way to catch big smallmouth, and that's what we're going to talk about today. A little bit about myself. I fish tournaments. I'm also an outdoor writer. I work for a lot of different brands. I do a lot of stuff in the fishing industry, and really, it's all so I can fish. I mean, that's my passion, just like all of you. I love fishing. I love catching fish. So I've kind of changed my life around so I can do that full time, and I love it. And I'm happy to share things that I've learned along the way about swim baits for smallmouth. Like I said, two of my very favorite things. But I'll go ahead and we're going to start off with a quick poll. But the other thing is, if you have any questions, just send them off at any time. There's a Q&A tab below. Just anytime you have questions, we'll get to them. And if not, we'll answer them all at the end. So any questions you have, feel free to ask. We're going to start with a poll real quick. And everybody, this will be recorded as well. This is going to be on YouTube. I'll put it on my YouTube as well. So for the recorded version, you can't see this poll, but the question is, what is your favorite swim bait for smallmouth? And I just use a couple, most of the most popular styles, like the Kitech style, hollow belly, glide baits, jointed baits, other or never tried them. So we'll give that a little bit more, and it's about what I thought it would be. It's kind of mixed all over the place for the results, and I'll share those as well once we finish up. Okay. See more people jumping on, so yeah, we'll just give this a second for everyone to answer this question. Okay, just about everybody's voted on the poll. And like I said, the recorded version won't show all this, but I'll go ahead and kind of give you the results. About 50% or so have voted for the Kitech style, hollow belly, other or never tried them. All have a few votes as well. So there's really nothing about the glide bait or the jointed bait, but that is okay. That just kind of gives me an idea of what we should focus more time on, and that's a great style of swim bait. So we'll go ahead and end the poll now. All right, so the title of the webinar is Swim Baits for Smallmouth, and specifically big smallmouth. I mean, that's something that I love to do, love catching big smallmouth. This is about a 6.17 is what it was, so that was on a swim bait. And ever since I started throwing swim baits, I've been catching more and bigger smallmouth. I live in an area of the country in Washington State where we catch a lot of smallmouth. And I really use a lot of finesse techniques, and I catch a lot of 4 and 5 pounders, and those are big, but to get the 5 and 6 pounders or more, swim baits over the past few years is how I've caught those. And my increase of numbers of fish has went up, or numbers of big fish, and it's strictly because of the smallmouth swim baits that I throw. So we're going to talk about that definitely. Okay, so as far as the agenda, I see some more people are joining now. So again, this is going to be recorded. If you have any questions, I'll answer them. Just go ahead and shoot it in the Q&A section. If I see it pop up, I'll respond to it right away. If not, we'll get to them at the end. But as far as the agenda, we're going to talk about different swim bait types, different retrieves, the rod, reel, and line, color selection, and then location as well. And kind of back up a little bit as far as the retrieves. Smallmouth love to chase things, so the swim bait is really perfect for them. It's a great way to cover water. It's a great way to catch big ones, and they're just in their nature. They're in areas that are perfect for swim baits. Those deeper rocky areas, those points. That's where they live, and that's where a swim bait really shines. So it really makes sense for them to eat a swim bait. It's perfect, a perfect fit for them. Largemouth will too, but something about them for smallmouth. Okay, so this webinar is sponsored by Optimum Baits. I'm not going to only talk about those baits. They make really awesome swim baits, but I use all different kinds. So I'll just kind of tell you a little bit about them. And what you see here pictured, we're going to be giving away 2 of these prize packs, identical. These are baits and colors that I picked out for smallmouth. So we're going to give out 2 of these from those of you who have registered and attended. So if you're on listening now, you're in the drawing, and I'll put that on my Facebook page after and reach out to you through email as well. So Optimum Baits, obviously. Rains, Depths makes great swim baits. AAs, which are these right here, and IMA. Those are all part of the same company or same group, so you can get those from OptimumBaits.com. Like I said, we're going to do that prize pack drawing later after I get the report of who attended and all that stuff. So thanks for attending. You're in the drawing. And just to tell you what these are, we'll talk about this a little bit. This is the Boom Boom swim bait. This is an internal weight design with the treble hook, as you can see there. These are the Opti Shads, which are great for on a jig head, on a weighted swim bait hook. You know, there's a lot of ways you can fish these. You can even fish them on an Alabama rig, you know, some of the smaller ones. And then these are the Bad Bubba Shad, which I really like. And I'll kind of tell you about those as we get into the jig head swim bait section of this. But they're awesome swim baits. And again, these are colors that I picked out specifically for smallmouth. Okay, so we're going to talk about swim baits. You know, first, we're going to talk about the Finesse swim baits. You know, we're going to talk about the hard swim baits, you know, the soft plastic versions, you know, the ones with the weight that are already inside, you know, that come molded around the weight with that harness, you know, the ones that you can just throw on a jig head, and then also swing heads as well. You know, a lot of people call it the biffle head, biffle bug, but I actually use those for swim baits, and we'll talk about that as well. It just makes a lot of sense, and it catches a lot of fish rigging a swim bait on one of those swing head football heads. If you're not familiar with that, we'll definitely talk about that. Okay, so Finesse swim baits. You know, this is kind of how I categorize it, and it's the smaller swim baits that are, I would say, 3 inches or smaller. You know, things with jig heads that are, you know, 3/8 ounce or less. Typically, I'm going to be using spinning gear just because they're so light. And then I'm really only going to fish them down to about 20 feet. So that's kind of the range for those Finesse swim baits. You know, they're really good for cold water as well as really warm water. So, you know, they work all the time, but those extreme conditions is where this type of swim bait will outperform the other, in my opinion. Now, the other thing we're going to talk about is the spy bait principle. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, the spy bait technique is a great way to catch smallmouth. It's basically a small bait that the idea kind of originated from the duo spin bait. And it just has little propellers on it, just very little action as you're reeling it in. And there's a way you can do this with swim baits, and I'll show you those. But it's a great way for fish to catch fish that are, you know, not very aggressive, you know, that are used to seeing flashy baits or vibrating baits. I mean, it's a great technique, and I'll show you the rig that I use for a swim bait that's kind of like that spy bait principle. Okay. Oh, hold on a second here. Hold on a second here. Hit the wrong button there. Okay, so like I was saying, the spy bait principle is a finesse swim bait that you can rig on a small jig head with a little propeller. This particular one is from Megabass. That's a spark shad, and this is their screw head. But this is a great finesse bait, and you know, this picture really doesn't give you a great visual of it, but that bait's like 3 inches long. I mean, it's really tiny, so maybe even less. I mean, the whole package is about 3 inches. You know, also fishing on an underspin is another great way to do it as well. This is a AA's as well. This is not that Bad Bubba shad that I was talking about. This is just their shad tail, which is a little bit thinner design. And then this is just an underspin. So, you know, when we're talking about retrieves for swim baits, you know, typically a slow and steady retrieve, you know, and just trying to keep it near the bottom. You know, that's where smallmouth, a lot of times they're going to be relating, you know, those rocks on the bottom. So keeping it close to the bottom, you know, ticking the bottom every once in a while is a good way to know that you're in the right area, you know, that you're doing the right thing, that you're not reeling it too fast or too slow, that you're making some sort of contact with the bottom, you know, not dragging it on the bottom, but just every once in a while hitting a rock or hitting something. And what that does is that also gives it a little bit of deflection as it hits off of there. And a lot of times that's where those strikes come from. But this technique also really excels in calm conditions, you know, clear water and those tough fishing conditions, you know, things where you wouldn't think of throwing a swim bait, or you would reach for a drop shot or a shaky head or something like that. You know, these finesse swim baits do a great job because they're not very intimidating. They're small, you know, they don't have a lot of action. You know, they just have just a standard, you know, shimmy to them as you're reeling them in. So they're not going to be too aggressive or anything else. All right, so we're gonna pause here for just a second. I'm gonna see if we have any questions. Hope we get back there. Okay. Okay. All right. So like I said, guys, if you're just joining us, you could feel free to Shoot questions over anytime. Don't have any yet, but I'm going to keep this up so I can keep a. Oh, there you go. Do have a question there. So good question, Anthony. So we'll kind of talk about the different rods and reels and stuff for it as well. But his question is the largest fluorocarbon for finesse swim bait. I would say the largest would be 10 pound, more often like a 6 and 8 pound. And I really like to have the braid to fluorocarbon when I'm using spinning, just because you can cast these light baits a lot farther. You're going to be able to feel that bait work a lot better with that braid to fluorocarbon. So I'm talking like a 15 or 20 pound braid with a 6 or 8 pound leader, basically the same exact setup that I use for drop shot fishing. But that's how I would do it. You know, if you get too heavy with the fluorocarbon, you're just going to actually hinder the action of the bait. So I would say definitely 10 is probably the most on that one. Good question. Okay, so moving from the little tiny baits to the giant baits, the glide baits, the S wavers and different glide baits. The smallmouth love these things. And they may be really big, they can't fit them all in their mouth, but they will attack them, and these treble hooks will catch them. I'll talk about retrieves as well, but another one of my favorites is a triple trout, and this is a jointed wooden bait. And again, smallmouth will annihilate this thing. This is a 6-inch version, and actually it's a 5-inch version, so that's a more appropriate size for smallmouth. Wake baits as well. This is another one that's just about the same size. It's 5.5 or so inches. This is a wake bait. It's great for smallmouth when they're shallow, when they're cruising, right before they spawn, while they're spawning, after they spawn. And then a lot of times during those summer months when they move up shallow in the morning to feed, wake bait is a great way to do it. It's kind of a good alternative to a topwater bait to get bigger bites, just because of the size of the bait. So we'll talk about the retrieves as well. Those glide baits, they have that big, wide S action, and it's really the action and the way that you're going to work the bait is going to depend on how active the fish are. And you could do that with a quick turn of the handle, and that will move it, a quick twitch of the rod. They really work on them on their own, but they glide like in a big S. Those wooden baits, really, I just use a steady retrieve or fast retrieve and really just try to keep the bait right under the surface. Same with wake baits, just slow and steady with some pauses mixed in. A lot of times, right when you start after a pause, that's where they're going to hit it. It's kind of like a topwater bait. You twitch, wait. Sometimes they hit it then, and then you twitch it again, and that's right when they hit it, because they're waiting for it to do something. So those are the kind of retrieves that I use for those wake baits. All right, so now we're moving into the jig head swim baits. And, the reason I put this picture in here of my box is just to show you how many different styles of jig heads and for that matter, how many different baits that I use. I have tons more, but these are just some of them that I use a lot. So, really my point of this whole thing is showing you this is there's a lot of different baits that you can use, and they're really all, better for a certain situation. They may have a tighter wiggle, they may have a bulkier body, they may have a wider tail kick. There's a lot of different actions to them. And the same thing, believe it or not, is actually you can do with the jig heads as well. The jig heads, we'll talk about some of the different ones, but like this one over here has a flat design, so it's going to have a lot different action than one that's more like a head of a fish. So definitely experiment with different ones to make sure that they match, they fit on there okay, they have the right hook that you're looking for. And there's a lot of factors that go into this, but really you can't go wrong having a variety of them. And as you can see, there's all different brands here as well, so I'm not hung up on just one brand. See right here, and I'm going to show you a few pictures and tell you what I caught them on, and then we'll jump into how I fish these jig head swim baits. This is a one I caught on a Kitech. You can see it down there. This is that bad Bubba shad. Like I said, kind of at the beginning, this is a lot thicker design in the picture, kind of a blurry picture there, but it's a lot wider, thicker, bulkier bait. So it's just going to have a meatier profile. And at times that's really important. The tail kick's really good on this one. Obviously the Kitech's really big. You guys were talking about that as well, or that was the most commonly used one. That has a really good tail action. This one has a little bit different tail action, but it still catches big smallmouth. This is the AA shad tail, which is kind of like that one I just showed you, but it's a thinner design, so it's going to have a little bit better action. This is Kitech again. Okay, so now we're gonna, before we jump into different retrieves and jig heads and stuff, I'll just tell you a few of the modifications that I do. One of them is cutting down a little bit on your, say your Kitech right here. That's just gonna, one, it's gonna make it a little bit smaller profile, but a lot of times it's gonna fit the head of the bait a lot better, of the jig head a lot better. And I'll show you another modification I do, but I do use super glue on these. And by just cutting off a little section of it, it's just gonna fit a lot snugger onto, a lot more snug onto your jig head. It's not gonna get loose from fish nipping at the tails. Your tail will get ripped off before anything else happens if you secure it with super glue. Another thing I do is I wrap wire around the hook, and I just leave the almost like a hook barb on either end, and that just secures it as well. Add that with super glue, and you will not have a problem with your bait sliding down at all. Okay. And like I was saying, there's a lot of different swim baits out there. They all have different actions, and what I do is I just kind of do a test. Just hold it straight up and down and see how far that tail goes to either side. Just hold it and see, and that's going to tell you how wide of an action it's going to have. It's not to say one is better than the other because it has more flexibility. It's just going to allow it to get a better idea of the bait and what it can do. One that barely moves over a little bit, it's going to have a lot tighter wiggle. If it is flopping all the way over, it's going to have a really wide shimmy. So for the ones with the really wide action, that's going to be more of the warmer weather, in my opinion, in my experience, where the one that just barely comes over is going to be better for cold water because it's just going to have a tighter wiggle to it. You can also adjust this as well through modifying with just dipping it in boiling water, just dipping the tail. You can get those baits to get way more action out of them. It also works really good if your baits, get kinked up, if you've taken them out of the original, say like the Kitech packaging, and they're kind of, deformed, and they're you can get them back to normal, just dipping them in boiling water really quickly, and it will remold them. So do that when your wife's not home in her nice, pots and pans, but it's a great way to do it, and you could kind of save baits as well. So, like I was talking about, there's tons of different jig heads out there. There's tons of styles, there's tons of shapes. There's some that are more realistic than others. There's some that are painted that are not. Some have keepers. There's a lot of different ones out there. And like I said a little bit earlier, there's no one that I always use. It's just going to depend on a few different things. For instance, this is a Strike King Squadron head. It's a more rounder design. Also the line tie is a little different, so it's going to swim differently than a straight one that's right out in front of it, or that's a 90 degree. They're all going to swim a little bit differently, so that will affect the action of your bait. So the message here is just to experiment with what works for you, what you have available, what fits the swim baits that you like, because there's a lot of great ones on there. This is a gambler version. It's almost like a keel action. It's flat. It swims a lot straighter. There's a lot of different things about this one. This is the VMC Pacemaker. What I like about this one is just that keeper on there. You put your bait on there and it's not going to come off. You don't have to do that super glue trick. You can, but that keeper keeps them on there. The downside is when you pull it off, it is shredded. So just be forewarned about that. This is the VMC version, kind of the same thing. It has those keepers, so it keeps it on there nice and snug, but it will damage your bait if you pull it off too quickly. These are one of my favorites here. This is the Revenge heads. What I like about these is just they're so realistic. They have a more of a cone type shape, kind of like the VMC. And then you have your big hammer over here as well. And what I like about those is they come in really big sizes, and they have really big hooks as well. So, I kind of just talked about that. Here's kind of some pros and cons of those, ones that I use quite often. The Strike King Squadron head, you guys can see what I wrote here, but pretty reasonable. The Gambler Swimbait head, really expensive, and it has that different action. VMC Pacemaker, it's a small profile too. That's one thing I didn't mention, because it has that, a lot of the weight of that is actually on the shank. So you're gonna have a lot smaller profile, and you're still gonna be able to get down deep if you have one of those, half-ounce style or half-ounce weights. Those VMC ones, good colors, like that wire bait keeper, Revenge head, really like those, very detailed, but they are expensive. So if you're fishing around a lot of rocks, you're gonna really hate it. I think they're $5 or $6 for two, so they're about $2 or $3 each. The big hammer, they have those big sizes and solid hooks. And one other one that I use quite a bit is the AA's version of it, and I like these because they have really good colors. They have giant hooks too. They have some versions that are really big hooks. So if you use some of the big Kitex, which I do sometimes, like the 5.8, this will fit it perfectly. It also this is a perfect color match for some of the perch style Kitex. There's that underspin I showed you earlier. Okay. I'm going to show you a few more of the different swim baits, and we'll talk about the actions, because these, and also the jig head swim baits, they have a pretty similar. I have a pretty similar approach to them. I'm actually going to pause for just a second. We're going to see if we have any more questions. Okay, good question. Adam says, he noticed a snap on my triple trout, and do I always use one, or do you use a direct line tie, or do you have any preference? It just kind of depends on the bait. If there's a split ring on the bait, that's fine. But there's times when a snap will get a better action of it. I just had that rigged at that moment because it will. You have more of a side to side action, and it just has a different action on it, that particular bait. So it really just kind of depends on the bait. But if it's a standard hard swim bait that has a split ring, that's fine as well if you want to tie it to that. Okay. So good question there. Like I said, guys, any other questions, just shoot them my way. We'll get to them. Okay. Okay, good question. And this is in relation to the S waiver that we talked about earlier, and it's tuning the S waiver, and it only waves left. So unfortunately, I've never had that issue, but Damon, I'll see if I can think of anything that can help you with that. I just haven't had that issue with mine. I mean, the ones I've had, they run great right out of the box. And it could be just the action or the action you're giving it as well. I mean, that could be one way to do it. I have to actually think about that a little bit and talk to some people. A good question. Okay. Okay, so like I was kind of saying that the weighted swim baits that we're going to talk about now, and then the style, the jig head style, I fish them very similar, and typically that's going to be fishing it near the bottom. This is one that you could fish more different depths. It swims really well. You can fish it near the surface. You can even skip it under docks. But typically for smallmouth, we'll be fishing it near the bottom, like I said earlier, trying to tick rocks, trying to make contact with the bait on the bottom. Just those slight changes once it hits a rock, no matter how hard you're reeling, no matter how slow you're bringing it, that misdirection, that change is where a lot of these bites come from on swim baits. Same thing with the bigger swim baits like the Huddlestons. And honestly, this is the only fish I've ever caught, only smallmouth I've ever caught on a Huddleston. It takes a big smallmouth to eat a Huddleston, but I definitely am going to keep trying. This is I think it was a 5-something pounder on a Huddleston 68. But I'm going to fish it the same way, bouncing it, just ticking on the bottom, not reeling it very fast, just crawling along the bottom like a trout that is just swimming along, doing his own thing. Same thing with the other weighted swim baits like the Boom Boom. It's going to be mostly fishing it near the bottom. And like I said, you can kind of see it in here. There's a weight inside of it, so it's going to, you can fish it deep, even though it can also be fished shallow. You can get it down there pretty easily because of that weight that's in there. Same thing with these live target. Same exact principle, reeling it very, very slow. Again, slower the better. Frequently ticking the bottom, and then a redirection like a crankbait. And I mentioned this earlier, but I do write articles, and I had an article that I wrote with Butch Brown, who is like the man for swim baits, and he was saying that is how he most often fishes his swim baits, just like a crankbait, just like a spinnerbait, really slow. just like a trout swimming along the bottom, you know, not trying to jerk it so it darts side to side or anything like that. Just like a fish swimming, you know, not trying to do too much to it, you know, and just think like a fish, you know, think like a trout that is, you know, maybe it was stalked or it's just looking for food or whatever it is. It's just swimming along. But then on the other hand, think like a bass. They're used to seeing that all the time. They're used to seeing trout, you know, just swimming along, you know, just looking for their next meal. So that's a perfect way to kind of think about your swim baits and, you know, how the action that you're putting on them as well. All right, so we're kind of moving along here. So I mentioned this as well, but I like to throw a swim bait like this Rain's Rock Vibe Shad or any other similar style bait on these swing heads. And it's just like the biffle bug technique. It's where you just drag it. This, if you're not familiar with this head swing side to side gives it a really wide wobble, but you fish it almost like a jig, but you still have that swim bait property of the tail kicking. These particular baits, you know, they have a tight wiggle, and just because this is the only section that really moves, but having that on that swing head, it gives it a really good action. And this is again the Rain's Fat Rock Vibe Shad. This is a 4-inch version. They also have smaller ones. You know, this is a 3.25, I believe it is. Yeah, 3.25. But yeah, just on these swing heads, you know, fish it just like you would a football jig. You know, you're going to be dragging it along the bottom a lot more, making a lot more contact than just once in a while contacting the bottom, like I was mentioning with the other swim baits. So really slow again. I mean, that's kind of the theme of the day is slow. Even though smallmouth like to chase, you know, I found that a slow retrieve is typically the best for all swim baits when it comes to smallmouth. You know, dragging on the bottom, lifting it and pulling it a lot, and getting a lot more action, lifting and pulling, using your rod a lot more than just your reel, you know, for this particular style of baits and with this swing head. All right, so moving along to colors. Let me check real quick. I don't know why the questions aren't. So. All right, sounds good, Damon. Okay, so when it comes to colors, you know, there's a lot of different schools of thought. I mean, you could match the hatch or just go crazy. You know, smallmouth do like bright colors. You know, colors like pink, white, and chartreuse are always good colors for smallmouth, just because I don't know why they just like those colors. You know, but water clarity is a factor. You know, typically with a swim bait, you're going to be fishing clearer water because it's such a visual technique. You know, it's not like a rattle trap. It's not like a spinner bait or a chatter bait or something like that where, you know, they can really feel it and feel the vibration of it. You know, so you want some clear water. So, you know, when it comes to colors, sometimes it is best to go natural, you know, really realistic, but again, those bright colors do work. So that size and action is really important as well. Or the size and action, I think, is more important than the actual color of the bait. You know, getting a bait that runs true, that you have the right jig head, that swims right. Everything else is just as important as colors, and I think that's true with any bait. You know, we all as anglers get hung up on, you know, having, you know, 50 colors of crankbaits, but, you know, think about it. How many have you actually caught fish on? You know, probably 5 or 6 or 10% of whatever you own. So that's kind of how I look at things. You know, I've tried to simplify, you know, the colors that I use, and, you know, I think that helps when you're fishing because you're not getting too distracted on, you know, having the secret color or something like that. So really just pay more attention to the size and the action, you know, what the fish are feeding on, and then just using it and sticking with it, and paying more attention to how you're retrieving it and everything else that goes along with that. All right, so we'll talk about rods. You know, I know we had that one question about line earlier, and we'll definitely talk about that. But when it comes to the big swim baits, you know, like the Huddlestons or, you know, any of those weighted ones that are going to weigh an ounce or more, this is the exact rod that I use. It's an 8-foot heavy. It's a Phoenix M1, but it's a great one for all big swim baits. It has a lot of power, and that 8-foot actually you can cast it a lot further. I'm a big believer in those longer rods when you're trying to make long casts. You know, for a standard jig head swim bait, anything that's a heavy action, again, I like those longer rods, like this 7'6" heavy. I have a few that are like 7'4" heavy, 7'7" heavy. I mean, anything along those lines that's a heavy action that's rated for something like this one is, like a 1/2 ounce to 2 ounce, is going to be more than enough for those jig head swim baits. So if you think about it, probably the most common size that I use is probably about a 1/2 ounce, and then you add that big bulky plastic itself. I mean, the swim bait probably weighs, I don't know, I've never weighed it, but it definitely weighs a good amount. So, it's a big size bait that you're not going to be throwing on a medium rod or something like that. So with a swim bait reel, I mean, a lot of these swim baits that we're talking about, like the jig head swim baits, you don't need a giant reel, just a standard bait cast reel, something with a standard gear retrieve, 6.4 to 1, 6.2 to 1, something like that, something that's not too fast where you're going to be constantly reeling it too quickly, or something that's too slow, like a 5.1, where you're going to be working a lot harder just to get the bait to do anything. So just an average reel that you probably have several of already. For those big swim baits like the Huddlestons or any of those weighted ones, I like the 300 size bait caster. I like the Daiwa Lexa is one of them that I use. It's a pretty inexpensive reel compared to some of the other ones. It's great. It has a great line capacity, so you can use that heavier line if you are doing that and still have tons of capacity and still be able to cast out there. For the Finesse swim baits, on spinning, I like a 7-foot medium. 7.2 medium. The one I'm using is a Phoenix Recon. It's a great rod, and it also doubles as a really good rod for tube baits, light football heads, things like that. So I do use it for more than just swim baits, but it really works well for swim baits. So selecting line, I know we had that question earlier, but we'll go back to it. I mean, generally it's going to be fluorocarbon, just because most of the time with this technique, you're going to be on the bottom. So fluorocarbon sinks, as you guys know, so that's going to help keep it on the bottom when you want it to be on the bottom. If you want it to be a little bit higher up, if you're using a wake bait or a wooden bait, I'm going to go with a mono or braid just because they float. So my exact setup that I use most for Finesse swim baits, I mentioned this earlier, but 15-pound smackdown braid with 8-pound Invisex or Tatsu leader. For those jig head swim baits, really like a 15-pound fluorocarbon is good. Those wooden or wake baits, a 50-pound braid or 20-pound mono is more than enough. And because it's a heavier line, it's actually going to float even more than a lighter mono or a lighter braid. Big swim baits, 20-pound Abrazex, that's what I go with. It's a great way, and I think 20-pound is more than enough. I don't think you need to use 25. If you go up that high, you do sacrifice casting ability just because it's thicker. So I think 20 is a good number for those big swim baits. All right, so we're gonna jump into the locations, and I'm gonna pause here for a second, see if we've got any more questions. So if you have any questions about what we've talked about so far, man, just let me know. Got some good ones so far. Cool. All right, here we go. Okay, good question about, I know I had that Megabass on there, that Mag Draft, and Adam recently purchased them, and any luck with them? Yeah, I have had luck with them. I have that pink one, which I've had more luck with than any other one. It's weird, but it looks really like a trout underwater. I mean, it looks like a hatchery trout in the water. It's really weird how it does look like a trout, even though out of the water it looks nothing like a trout. It's just that hue is really trout looking. Are they worth $13? Yeah, I would think so, definitely. They do rip up quite a bit. If you catch a few fish, I'd say 3-4 fish, then you're going to have to probably repair them with super glue or something like Mend It, which is a great way to fix all your swim baits. All right, so we had a question about how I tied the lure. So I'm gonna see if I can figure out what that is. Is it Mario? What lure are you talking about? Yeah, I don't know what lure but if you're talking about the knots, I mean, I use Palomar and everything, even though it's even if it's giant bait, I still tie Palomar. I just use a really big loop. So yeah, that's the only thing I can think of on that one. Okay, so we're gonna jump into some of the locations. Since I know a lot of you guys are from where I live in Spokane, we're gonna go over to Lake Coeur d'Alene because it's right here. And if you guys aren't familiar with what I'm showing you now, this is the Navionics web app, and you could do it for free. Just go to navionics.com and then click the web app portion right there, and you're gonna just zoom in. Okay, we'll go over here. So going to whatever lake you fish is a great tool to find fishing spots. You don't have to pay for anything. Just make sure that you hit this button down here below, because otherwise it's just the standard data, which is still pretty good on Coeur d'Alene, but hitting that sonar chart button, you're going to get a lot better detail. You're going to get those 1 foot contour intervals. So, automatically I just zoomed over here, and this spot just really stood out for me. I know this spot, it's really good. It's a big point. This is prime spot for swim baits just because it is a main lake point. The smallmouth, it's really rocky. The smallmouth are on this area. So zooming back out a little bit, this is going to be a great location, really, honestly, year round. Any of these points that are main lake are going to be great. As it moves towards spring, fish are going to be looking more towards spawning, obviously. So you're going to look for something that is like that, but is close to somewhere that they would spawn. So smallmouth do spawn a little bit deeper, but they're still going to be spawning in a lot of this shallower water, so this bluer stuff. So I would say some of these smaller points leading into the spawning area for both pre-spawn and post-spawn fish. I think that's a great approach to finding fish right before they spawn and right after they spawn. They could even spawn here. Looks like a flat area because it's a lot of blue together. And right by these docks, I mean, that would be a nice place to catch spawning smallmouth. So, just thinking backwards, throwing a swim bait in the pre-spawn and post-spawn, it'd be maybe this first point over here. It would be a good spot. But anything similar to that, if the lake that you fish, or if you fish a river, any points that smallmouth, that are smallmouth looking, with a lot of rocks, places where there's current breaks in the water in the river. Excuse me. Those are all good places to throw swim baits. Really, if there's smallmouth around, swim baits will catch them. All right. Good question. We'll go ahead and pause here for a second. We've got a few questions. So do I ever touch up baits like chartreuse dyes on the tails? I really don't for swim baits. I do for drop shot baits more often, or even flipping and pitching baits. Typically chartreuse is the color that I use for like a green pumpkin bait or watermelon bait. If I'm looking to imitate bluegill or perch or something like that, I will touch them up with different dyes. But really with swim baits, I really don't do it. There's so many good colors on all these baits that I mentioned. You really don't have to, in my opinion. Okay, other question is on Huddleston retrieves. Do you rip on the bottom, fall rates, and if you guys aren't familiar with the Huddleston, they come in different fall rates, and that just like it sounds, they're going to fall slower or faster based on the rate of fall that they're built at. So they're just basically heavier. But that's just going to depend on how deep you're fishing. But you just want to have it near the bottom either way. So one's just going to get there a lot faster. As far as retrieves, I've had my best luck for largemouth and smallmouth. Like I said, I've only caught one smallmouth on actual Huddleston, but fishing it very slow, just ticking the bottom. Not dragging on the bottom, but just every once in a while hitting the bottom, almost like I can't think, maybe a spinner bait or something like that. If you're dragging it along the bottom, where you're just hitting cover, things like that. Just slowly bouncing off the bottom and getting that redirection action. Good question. Okay, I'm gonna zoom out of here. Okay. Oh, okay. That makes sense, Mario. So Mario had said, check the way I tied lure, and I was talking about, Palomar knots and all this stuff that had nothing to do with what he was talking about. But he was saying, this is for Damon with the S waiver question. He said that it may be how you had just had it tied. So, that could affect the action according to Mario. So thank you, Mario. And yeah, just to clarify what I was talking about with the rate of fall, for instance, like a 10 is going to fall 5 feet in 5 seconds. So it's just going to fall that much faster or slower. So thanks for clarifying that. But yeah, there's different rates for those Huddlestons. So thank you, Mario. Help me out, do my job. Okay. All right. Like I said, if you guys have other questions, just send them my way, but we'll get back into the presentation here. Skip back a little bit. That was weird. And we're basically about done with the actual webinar portion of it. So this is a great time if you have more questions. There's been some good ones so far, and there's a few more that I have to get to. But I do have another webinar coming up, Advanced Jerkbait Fishing. That's going to be March 15th. Same time, same way to register, everything else. I'll send you guys all an email at the end with a link to that registration as well. But just like this one is on Swimbaits, it's going to be on Jerkbaits, which it's getting that time here. And if you have any follow-up questions, I will send you guys an email with my Navionics email, but I can be reached at Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all these different ways to reach me. If you have any follow-up questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this will be recorded. It will be on YouTube, maybe even tonight or definitely by tomorrow. So if you came in late or wanted to see what I was talking about in a certain section, it'll be there. Okay. I'm going to jump into the Q&A. So see what you guys got for me. Okay, so Damon, just clarifying, yeah, 5 inches per second, 12 inches, yep. The RF5 and RF12, yeah, that's the most commonly used terminology. Okay. And then Damon also said I use both the improved clinch knot and also double tied or Rapala loop. Yeah, I mean, I would just try to. I still, like I said, I still use a Palomar, even though it's kind of a pain to tie because you have to have that giant loop. I still think it's the best knot. Either in the improved clinch. I'd have to look at how you had it tied, but there's a way that it could affect the glide bait of it. Okay, another question, do I use A-rigs much? If so, what bait sizes and colors? I really don't use them very much. I've caught fish on them, but I really don't like using them, and I have nothing against people who do. I've thrown them a lot, and in my experience, you get tons of followers on them, and not many fish strike it. I don't know why, but that's happened to me several times in really clear water, like Lake Havasu. I was down there for a tournament, and I had piles of fish following it. But then I'd pick up a single swim bait and catch them. So kind of shied away from it. But a small Kitech or a small, any small, like a hollow belly or anything like that will work. Adam said, mentioned cold water. Are we talking good for cold? Is like we have a tournament coming up on Moses Lake. Generally, I probably won't be using a swim bait that early just because it's going to be like ice out. Some people might have success with it, but typically I'm going to be using a crankbait or a jerkbait or something like that time of year. Not to say that it won't work, but I haven't had as much success very early in the year. I mean, that same temperature late in the year, though, for some reason, is like a different world for me, in my opinion. It could be 40 degrees in March and 40 degrees in November, and that November they will eat it. I think it's something to do with like the fish are just feeding up, obviously, for the winter, and I don't know what the case is, but it's like they were recently eating good and now it's cold, so they're more apt to chase things versus being dormant all year. That's just kind of my philosophy on that. Good question, Patrick. What is the preferred jig head weight? And I would say really average, probably ½ ounce is probably the one I use the most. I mean, there's times where I use a 3/4. There's times where I go really light. I'd say half is probably my prime. In preferred depth, I would say preferred depth would be when they're concentrated in that 20 to 30 foot range when I'm using those big jig head swim baits like the Kitech or something like that. Really just whatever depth they're at, but when they're concentrated in that depth, they will eat a swim bait really good. Another question. Underspin, ignore if I missed it, but the best use for schooled suspending bass. Yeah, underspin's great for when fish are chasing shad. You know, I know Damon, where we live, there's no shad, but you know, if they are suspended eating bait fish like that, underspin's good. But really, just that flash in general is a great add-on to any swim bait, really, at times. Oh, Anthony, Massachusetts is tungsten only. Okay, any preference with tungsten jig heads? Yeah, that's too bad. I didn't know that it was official. Well, that underspin I was talking about, that Eco Pro Thunderspin, that is tungsten. You know, they unfortunately they made one, but they don't make it anymore. It was called the Bedhead, and it was a smaller style bait, and it takes it is perfect for small swim baits, but I'm just kind of wasting my time because it's not available anymore. But if you can find it, it's called the LR Bedhead. But they're not very big, but for small Kitex, I think they're like 1/8 ounce or 3/16 ounce, maybe the biggest one. But those are fully tungsten. I can't think of any other, you know, bigger style tungsten jig head, but someone should make one, definitely. That's too bad. Damon, when are you gonna take me fishing? As soon as the ice melts. Okay. All right, any other questions, guys? All right, and like I said, we have that drawing. If you guys missed the beginning, this was sponsored by Optimum Baits. Like I said, I didn't just talk about them the whole time. I promised you I wouldn't. But they're actually going to be giving out a prize pack, 2 separate ones. I'm going to get the report of who actually registered. I'm going to do a drawing. I'll put it on my Facebook, and if you're not on my Facebook, then we'll get you an email. But I'll do that as soon as I get the report. There's 2 prizes, so pretty good odds. Oh, another question here. Okay, so this has to do with a double jointed swim bait. Seems to have a problem with the treble getting caught in the joints. It may be just a specific bait, or it could be, it's hard to say. What bait is it? Just go ahead and shoot that over, Adam. I haven't seen that, but it could be also your retrieve and how you're working the bait, you know, where it's too wide. Okay, it's a Strike Pro. You know, I'm not familiar with that particular bait or what it looks like, but yeah, let me know later. It may just be a cheap bait. I mean, I don't know the answer to that without seeing, or it could be the retrieve, or it could be the hooks that are on it could be too big. There's a lot of things that could factor into that. All right, any other questions, guys? All right, if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and end it here. But thank you all for attending. Like I said, I have that next webinar coming up in about a month. It's March 15th on jerkbait fishing, kind of similar concept, but we're going to be talking about jerkbaits, and it is prime time for jerkbaits coming up. You know, it's a great late winter technique. There's times where that's all I throw right when spring hits. So right when there's no more ice, it's a great way to catch largemouth and smallmouth. I mean, but it works all year. But that's a awesome time of year. Is that, you know, usually my first bass of every year is caught on a jerkbait. So I'm excited to talk about those. And we'll get some more prizes too. I think we're going to do some Seagar in Vizex, 10 pound. I have a couple spools of that we can give out. Maybe we'll get some jerk baits for prize packs. So again, thank you all for attending, and we're going to go ahead and end it here, but we'll see you at the next one.